Thanks for taking the time to join us for today's webinar, 4 Reasons Board Self-Evaluations Are Ineffective. My name is Diane Johnson, and I'm part of the marketing team here at Diligent. I'm joined today by my colleagues Dottie Schindlinger and Jeff Creasy. Dottie is Diligent's governance technology evangelist. In this role, she provides thought leadership on governance and technology topics for a variety of print and digital publications. She teaches dozens of webinars annually and presents both at conferences and in boardrooms to directors and executives globally. Jeff is responsible for Diligent's modules business, which consists of Diligent Messenger, Director and Officer questionnaires, and evaluations. Before we get started today, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar should last about 45 minutes. It will be recorded and a replay will be sent out to all registrants shortly after this session. Please feel free to share the replay with your colleagues. Also, feel free to ask your questions at any time by utilizing the questions pane in the GoToWebinar panel. Now I'd like to hand things over to Dottie and Jeff to take us through the rest of today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Diane. This is Dottie Schindlinger, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. Today we're going to spend just a brief amount of time to talk a little bit about board evaluations. We'll be providing a bit of background in terms of what board evaluations are all about, the different kinds of board evaluations that companies regularly do. We'll also talk a little bit about why board evaluations are fairly unpopular and what we think of as sort of unsuccessful, in the sense that they don't seem to lead to a lot of change. And yet we have data to suggest that change is desired, and so we'll talk a bit about that data. And then we're going to be talking about some strategies that you can use to make the process both easier to handle as well as more meaningful and actually more successful. So just to start out a little bit, for most companies, board evaluations are an annual exercise. In many cases, companies are required to conduct annual board self-assessments, particularly if you're on some of the exchanges that require board evaluation, like the New York Stock Exchange. Also, for many healthcare organizations, board evaluations are required every year, really because of CMS regulation or CMS ratings put together by Medicare and Medicaid. So in some cases, you are required to conduct a board evaluation annually. Other companies, especially private companies and private organizations, don't really have any sort of requirement to do this, but it is considered a best practice. And so many companies, regardless of whether or not they're required to do board evaluations, are interested to conduct an annual board assessment just to make sure that the board is performing at peak and to identify any areas that need to be addressed throughout the year. Now, when evaluations are done the right way, they can be extremely valuable. What it does is really help the directors know how the performance is being viewed by peers. It allows the board to have a little bit of time to reflect on its own performance and discuss issues of performance. Also, if it's done well, particularly if it's done anonymously, it gives an opportunity for directors to voice concern, things that they're observing, without the fear of retaliation and potentially blowback from that type of whistleblowing, if you will. So it gives directors an outlet to say things that are on their minds, things they are concerned about, but doing that in such a way that all those comments are kept anonymous. It also is really important to do this to address any sort of performance problems. So particularly on individual director level, we know from some of the data that there are potentially some issues with individual director performance. Maybe they don't really have the right skill set or skill mix for where the company is at its current stage of development and current strategy. And what we're finding is that with the levels of incumbency on boards, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect in terms of the makeup of the board and what the company really feels that it needs in order to be successful. And so if it's done well, board evaluation should help you not only identify that, but give you data and a platform from which you can have those conversations with directors and really figure out what you want to do next. And then finally, doing board evaluations helps shareholders and stakeholders know that the company is really taking board performance seriously and that the board itself is taking its job seriously. So there's a lot of good reasons to do board evaluations, and board evaluations come in many flavors. The most common, by far the most common, is full board self-assessment. And what that means is that the directors as a body, each individual director, rates the board's performance on the whole. So basically, you would have a questionnaire, you would go through and answer the questionnaire, and you rate the full performance of the board. There are also two different kinds of individual director self-assessments. One would be where directors rate their own performance, where they maybe are given a set of criteria for what their job was to include for the year, and then they go through that and reflect a little bit on how well they feel they've performed against that set of criteria. Finally, there's also peer-to-peer assessment. Of course, because the board is the highest level of authority in the organization, there really isn't anyone over the board that would do a performance assessment with each director. So in that case, the only way that boards tend to do that kind of performance assessment on the individual level is to do peer-to-peer evaluation. So each director would anonymously rate the performance of every other director. And then from that data in aggregate, you would be able to see whether there are any particular performance issues happening for any particular director. So just to break that down a little bit, some of the goals of the full board assessment really to track board performance over time. In many cases, if it's the first time a company has conducted a full board self-assessment, the actual numbers and data for that first time aren't as important as how those numbers move over time. So they may get a baseline and say, okay, how do we feel about this baseline? And are there different places where we want to apply some focused energy over the course of the coming year to see if we can move that performance needle up or down in different areas? Also, I would say, with full board assessment, when companies are asked, as they are, kind of every year on director surveys, and we'll talk about some of them, this is the kind of board self-assessment they are generally thinking about. So when they're asked, do you conduct board evaluations? Usually this is what they're thinking about. They're thinking about this questionnaire that goes out to the directors. They all fill it out, and this is an annual board self-assessment. Now, in terms of the questionnaires themselves, there is absolutely zero uniformity in terms of how long questionnaires are, what questions are on the questionnaires, how many of those questions are rating scale, open-ended. There's almost no guidance from any of the regulatory bodies that require self-assessments of boards to use certain questions or questionnaires. So often you'll get questions like, what's the right length of a board self-assessment? And the truth is there really is no one answer. There is no right answer. I've seen this vary. I mean, in some cases I've seen board self-evaluations as short as 5 or 6 questions and some as long as 150 questions. And so there really is no consistency at all. What I would say is that when board self-assessment is done well, there are enough questions to really allow you to get a good picture and a good feel for the different areas of responsibility that the board is involved in and how they feel they've done on each one of those levels, but not so many questions that it becomes just this ridiculous exercise that no one is going to complete the questionnaire. So there's kind of a sweet spot in there somewhere. What that magic number is, I really couldn't tell you. The sample that I've seen and used has somewhere between 20 and 35 questions, and that's, it's a little bit long, so it takes a little bit of time, but it's not so long that you're never going to get any responses back. Also, in most cases with a board self-assessment, they're conducted either completely anonymously, where absolutely zero people know who's responded and how they've responded, or at least confidentially, meaning maybe there's someone who is administering the board self-assessment and they kind of know who said what, but they don't share that information broadly, and the results are only shared in aggregate, either with the full board or with a committee that is managing the board evaluation process, who then would communicate those results back to the board. Again, as we talked about, there are almost no guidelines from regulators on what questions are required or what the criteria should be for rating performance of the board. And so, it's very much a self-policing activity, but that doesn't mean that it's without value. I think especially if the board is very clear on what its overall purpose is, taking a moment each year to say, and how are we doing on meeting that purpose, is a very important exercise. That said, we do know that with board self-assessments, the results tend to skew high on average, and that's true in every industry. Basically, when you look at the results of board self-assessments, often what the board is saying they feel about their performance doesn't match when directors are asked candidly and anonymously on national surveys how well they feel their boards are doing. So there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect there. And just really quickly to run through individual self-assessments, again, there are 2 different kinds. The first kind is where individual directors rate their own performance, and really the goal of that kind of an assessment is to allow directors to identify areas where they would like to improve and where they would like to get some support or perhaps additional development in their role as a director. This is a much less common approach than the full board self-assessment, and by much less common, I know we have some data here that we'll share in a bit, but I think there were maybe around 41% of companies that do individual director assessments, and whether they are self-assessments of each individual, whether they're peer-to-peer, wasn't reported. It's just about 41% conduct director-level evaluations in addition to their full board assessment, so much less common. They're often conducted fairly sporadically. They may not be annual. They may be, after 1 year of service of that director, and then maybe not again for a number of years, or they may be conducted every other year. And sometimes they're only conducted when the board already knows there's a problem and they're trying to find a way to have some meaningful data that they can use to identify the specific issues that need to be addressed, and maybe also to have a difficult conversation with a director. So they can be very sporadic. Most of the questionnaires for these types of assessments are open-ended. There may be some rating scales, but generally speaking, when you're doing an individual self-assessment, it's a time for that person to reflect and to share some more detailed and nuanced information. So they tend to be more open-ended. Couple things about the results. Again, these are usually not done anonymously because each person is only rating themselves. Usually that information then would get shared with a committee. Maybe it would be shared with the lead director or even the full board. But more often than not, since this is kind of a personal exercise, they're not often shared very, very widely. It's more so for the individual director to voice, here are the things I think I did well, here are the things I'd like to do better, here's the support and the development that I need to get there, and then really kind of working with a committee or with the lead director on developing an action plan. These are usually not required by regulators. This is, when they say board evaluation, they're usually kind of loose about what they mean by that, but they don't typically call out the need for individual director assessments. And then just like a full board assessment, sometimes the results can be a bit skewed, depending on the individual self-biases. Either someone kind of thinks they're awesome or maybe not so much. And so often their reflections will be skewed a little bit by how they feel in that moment. What's interesting is that the peer-to-peer assessment, in many respects, has the most potential, if it's done well and if it's done right, to affect change. And yet it is, I think, by far the least common instrument that's used in board evaluations. With peer-to-peer assessment, you have the opportunity to have something be completely anonymous. And when I say completely anonymous, really there should be almost no way for anyone to ever see who said what or who's responded or who hasn't responded. But ideally what you would have is an opportunity for every director to rate every other director and include themselves, because if it's anonymous, you don't know who the respondent is, on a set of criteria. And that set of criteria should be based on the job description of the director. So you have a set of things that the director is supposed to do, and then you ask every other director to say, and how well are they performing in these areas? And they might be things like, comes prepared to meetings, or provides valuable insight, or is knowledgeable in the areas that our company needs to be successful in our industry. So it's a very good idea to do these kinds of evaluations. They're done very infrequently, and I think partly this is because, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, evaluation for boards generally is sort of seen as just a necessary evil, something we have to do to keep people happy, rather than an exercise that actually gives us data that's useful and that we can actually then act on. And we'll talk a little bit about that because that is a bit of a problem. So let's just start with high-level overview on who's actually doing board evaluations. I mentioned some of this data a moment ago, but in public companies, about 90% are conducting full board evaluations. 78% also conduct committee evaluations, and that can be important depending on the size and scale of the company, the size and scale of the number of committees. But it may be useful to do, for example, an evaluation of the audit committee, since it may include more independent directors. It might be useful to conduct a separate evaluation of the audit committee, or if you're in healthcare, maybe of the quality and safety committee, or even the med exec committee if it's an external body. So that is happening with some frequency. Again, only about 41% conduct individual director performance assessments. Again, we don't know from that data whether that is a board individual director self-assessment or whether that's a peer assessment. But again, it's not the most common that is happening. And as you'll see in a moment, I think that might be something that could change and really make a big difference. And so then we also want to just point out that in terms of private companies, only a little under half of private companies are conducting evaluations with their boards, but that half breaks down as follows. About 59% of family businesses are conducting board evaluations versus 24% of investor-owned boards. That's probably not super surprising, considering investor-owned boards, they may have many different companies in their portfolio. They might serve on, 8 or 10 different boards, however many companies are in the portfolio. And so taking the time to do evaluation of their performance on one part of their portfolio versus another might just be seen as not a particularly useful exercise. But yet, we'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons why we think that is probably not true. So let's take a moment. I'd like to launch a poll at this point and just find out what you're doing. So for those of you that are joining us on this call, Diane, if you have the opportunity to launch the first poll, let's find out what kinds of board self-assessments each of you are doing. And Diane, if you need me to launch it from here, just let me know. Okay, so there should be a poll that is in front of you now. So hopefully you're able to see the poll. And what we're asking is just what kind of assessment your board does. So if all you do is the full board self-assessment, pick that first option. If you do a full board self-assessment and an individual self-assessment, pick the second option. If you do the full board assessment and a peer-to-peer assessment, pick that third option. And if you do nothing at all, if you don't do evaluations yet at all, go ahead and pick that final option. So let's take a second and let those results come in. And then as soon as we get those results in, we'll share the results back with everybody. So Diane, we'll just give that maybe another 30 seconds here. And so please click the button that corresponds to you. And then we'll close the poll and share the results. So I think we can probably go ahead and close the poll now. Okay, so hopefully you're able to see those results there on your screen, but we have 52% of the audience is doing full board self-assessment, so that's a little bit less than our national average, but that's okay. About 26% are not doing board evaluations yet, so maybe we've got some more private entities on the phone, and if we do, welcome, and thanks for checking this out. We have only 13% that are doing individual self-assessment and only 9% that are doing peer-to-peer self-assessment. So again, those numbers are a little lower than the national average, but I think kind of in line with what I'm saying, which is that the most common is going to be the board self-assessment and the least common is going to be the peer-to-peer evaluation. So thank you for that. You can turn off the poll now and let's continue on with the slide deck. So hopefully everybody can see the slides again. So just going on a little bit, let's talk about some of the data around, I'm mentioning this, why we really believe that board evaluations matter. And there is some good data to back this up. Every year, PricewaterhouseCoopers does a great survey called the Annual Corporate Directors Survey. And by the way, the data that I shared on the last slide is from the National Association of Corporate Directors. They also do an annual survey, which is terrific, and it's the Annual Corporate Directors Survey. So in the PricewaterhouseCoopers research, something that we found really interesting, we were just looking at the last year's data, and a little more than half of the respondents said that they made no changes based on their board evaluation. Now, that's interesting because the next thing that we learned from this data was that 35% of the directors responding believe that at least one director should be replaced on their board. So there's a disconnect there. So if you've got more than half that aren't making any changes, but you've got over a third that think that a director should be replaced, and the most common reasons that they articulate why that director should be replaced are that person comes unprepared for meetings, or that person doesn't have the required expertise. You would think, if you're doing evaluations right, you should know that. You should have that data, and you should be able to take that data and do something with it. That's really the whole point. So the reason why board evaluations really matter, they only matter, quite frankly, if you're taking that information, you're doing it in such a way that it is actionable. It should be actionable information. Either it's, hey, look, we clearly have someone on the board where there's almost a unanimous consent that that person just isn't the right fit for the board at this time. And it might be nothing wrong with that person. It may just be that the company has changed, the strategy has changed. Maybe they were amazing 10 years ago when they joined the board, but now their skills just don't fit the needed requirements for this particular time in the company's history. And that can happen, and it happens all the time. But unfortunately, there's a lot of inertia when it comes to director composition. And in particular, what we know is that the average length of tenure for corporate boards is now almost 9 years. That's the average. It can go much higher than that. We've got some statistics that show corporate directors that have been on that same board for over 20 years. So if the average is 9 years, that's kind of telling you something. It's telling you that there's a lot of inertia around replacement of directors. Now, what's interesting is when you look at the status of board refreshment, it looks like a much rosier picture, because last year, about 60%, I think it was at 61% of companies have added a new director. But when you go and ask, okay, why did you add a new director? What they don't cite is we learned from our evaluation data that we were sorely missing in certain areas. Instead, they just felt they needed to add some additional skill sets. They don't base that on the evaluation. They just, recognize like, hey, we're soft on the cybersecurity front. We don't have anybody that understands, cybersecurity, and we really need to make sure we have that expertise on our board. Or they're responding to investor pressure. About half of the respondents said that they added another director really mostly for diversity based on investor pressure. So what all that is saying to me is that we're not really doing a very good job with board evaluations. And there really, I think, are 4 reasons why board evaluations go kind of badly. The first one is that there's a lot of inertia and apathy. The apathy is all around, look, the company's okay, we don't want to rock the boat, and it may even be because of personal relationships. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of directors serve together for years and years and years, and you might know darn well that that person is just not the right fit for what the company needs right now. But, if you guys are out on the golf course every Tuesday, it's going to be really hard for you to raise your voice and say, look, this person's amazing, but they're not amazing for this board at this moment. They're not actually doing what the company needs, and they're taking up a seat that we probably need to fill with someone else. So there's quite a bit of apathy there. And part of that apathy is born out of the fact that the evaluation process itself doesn't really provide enough protections for people to be able to have that kind of candid input. So they don't feel that what they would say is going to be kept completely anonymous and completely secure. And they're really concerned about the consequences of being candid, of being too candid, and saying, this candidate really isn't right for us and we need to make a change. They're very concerned about what's going to happen after they voice that concern. There needs to be a much better process in place. And the bad process is probably the biggest problem. If it's not required, why bother? A lot of people feel, and they feel that way because the questions get asked the same way every year. It's probably the same instrument every year, even though the company changes dramatically, even though the board's focus might need to change dramatically. We're just kind of doing the same check the box routine every year. We're not taking that data, reflecting on that data, acting on that data, and then saying, what do we need to adjust about this year to make sure that we can not only benchmark where we've come from, but also figure out where we're going to. And so that kind of produces a little bit of hopelessness. This is a waste of time. We do it because we have to, not because we want to, and the process never really improves. And a lot of people, when asked, do you believe that improving the process for evaluations is an important component of the board's work next year, they say no, but it's because they're not recognizing what they're missing. And so on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jeff, and he's going to talk a lot more about the process. So there are some specific fixes to make the process much, much better. So Jeff, do you want to take it over from here?
Sure, thanks, Dottie.
Let me make you the presenter. Okay, and you should be able to now present.
Great. Thank you, Dottie, for that great overview and background on the board evaluation process. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and show you some tools from Diligent that we think can help you drive a more meaningful evaluation process. And what I'm going to start with is actually an administrative view of Diligent Boards, which is our flagship product. And this is actually the world's most widely used board portal. It's used by more than 145,000 users and nearly 5,000 organizations worldwide. And it's, we have very stringent security, we have award-winning training and support, and that's led us to an outstanding 98% retention rate amongst customers. But we've really differentiated ourselves by focusing not just on this board portal and not just on the administrator and director experience and corporate governance, but on the total life cycle of managing a board. And we've done that by tightly integrating modules to support board management, such as our director and officer questionnaires platform, our evaluations module, which you're going to learn a lot about today, and a secure communications platform. What I'm going to focus on for you today is going to be the evaluations module, which is really going to give you a sense of how Diligent can provide a really powerful one-stop corporate compliance suite of solutions for you to make your corporate governance much more effective. So first things first, you can see here we're in this admin console, and one of the first things you'll notice is that we give administrators right away a really intuitive and easy to follow interface that's going to give you links directly to a questionnaires creation manager right from your initial landing page. So anytime you log into Diligent boards to administer it and provide new content for your executives and directors, you'd be able to quickly link into this questionnaire manager. And by the way, I'm just going to share some screenshots here. I'm not going to give a live demo until we get to a director portion of the discussion here. But I do want to show this experience from the creation side all the way through the director experience up to and including the post-assessment reports that you'll receive on the back end. So the first thing you'll see here in the questionnaire manager is that it's a really feature-rich interface, and it's got some obvious cues here on how to create and edit new content, along with some easy links to past evaluations or evaluations already underway. And in fact, we do use this questionnaire manager to drive a number of different processes for our customers, including just basic surveys and the director and officer questionnaire process, as well as the board self-assessment process. So we're going to be digging into the assessment process here more by seeing how we created one of these today. And you'll see things like large icons to drive new creation, and then ways you can, of course, edit, preview, and duplicate content as you need to, and then finally publish it when you're ready to. And we'll walk through those various steps. So the first page you'll see here is going to give you the basic tool and the interface that you'll be working in when you go to create a survey or an assessment within the Diligent framework. One of the first things you'll notice is that we have this nice sort of table of contents area over here. And, I think Dottie alluded to the fact that content and the organization and structure of a assessment is a really important part of the process to drive meaningful engagement with the board and ensuring there's good content in these surveys that is eventually actionable. And dividing it and organizing it in a really meaningful way is a big part of that process. So you'll see here we've built out a survey that I would say represents some best practices in this process, a survey that includes board competencies, board composition, board performance, and board structure and operations. You're always going to be able to provide an introductory page for your directors, and then you're also going to be able to create a wide variety of different questions, anything from texts to list questions, tables, numbers, dates, and emails, and even provide additional instructions throughout the interface as needed. So here's an example of an introductory slide. This is going to offer you a nice opportunity to brand it as well, and let folks see that you are driving their part of the process here. The introduction, excuse me while I go back a second. The introduction is a great way to set the tone, set the table with the directors in terms of what this process is going to be about and how the results are going to be used, certainly stressing that survey results can be anonymous if you so desire, as most folks do, and really set the tone also for how many of the questions will be answered. One of the more common types of questions that we do utilize is text type questions. These are going to be general comments, free form type responses. So certainly we see a lot of those in surveys. And there's a couple features to point out here, such as the fact that you can make questions contingent, so you can tie them to one another, and only be answered if a question is answered in a certain way. And you can drive them as required or not to make sure that you get the meaningful responses that you need on the most important questions. I would say that the list type question is the most common that we see utilized in this tool. And this is going to be the type of objective, rateable question that you can provide. And I'll give you an example of what this looks like in completed fashion. So you're going to be, adding a question into the survey tool, and it would look like this to you in the administrative interface as well as a director once they get to see it. And you can see you can apply different rating tools from 1 through 5, 1 through 10 it could be. There's no firm requirement on how you do it. It's flexible enough to accommodate you and your needs. And you can also add labels to these. So you could say 1, not at all, 5, very likely, for example, to drive some more depth in the interface for the directors there. One of the other really great tools we have is the ability to drive table questions, and I think this is a great way to do those peer-to-peer assessments that Dottie spent some time focused on. And you can see here, I think this represents some really nice best practices in terms of the types of questions that could drive a really great peer-to-peer evaluation process, such as directors demonstrate a high level of competence in their director role, they arrive fully prepared to participate in meetings, and they provide meaningful and useful insights and observations. So by listing out your directors here and rating them all independently within a table structure, that could be a really effective way to drive that kind of meaningful response content. One of the features I really like here, and certainly this comes in handy for me as I build out evaluation templates for demonstrations and customers as we onboard them, is a duplication tool. This is essentially a copy and paste tool that allows you to go back, grab previous content from already completed sections of the survey and bring them forward to a new area that you need to create without having to go through the process of creating a brand new survey type question or content. So it makes it really easy to build these out. You can build out probably a 30 question survey here in and I'd say about 30 to 45 minutes, which is really nice. Once you are through this process, it's going to be a really good idea. In fact, throughout the process, a really good idea to preview your assessments. You can experience them from the director perspective. With a single click, you can transition right into this type of view, which is going to give you an interface on your desktop or laptop to reflect what a director would see when they're ready to do the survey. So I always recommend taking a look at this throughout the process to make sure it's formatted and looks good from your perspective. Once you feel it's ready, you're going to be ready to publish it. And a single keystroke will kick off this process just by clicking the publish icon over here. And it's going to bring up some various steps in the process. And right at the outset of the process, we're going to give admins a very obvious checkbox to make sure that you can keep the submissions in the survey anonymous. So by clicking this, you can rest assured that when your directors respond, there's not going to be any way for folks to tease out who responded to what and who provided what answers here. The next thing you're going to see in the process is essentially selecting, who's going to be a part of this survey, who's going to respond to the survey. And this is one of the really nice advantages of having a survey tool, an assessment tool built right into your board portal as it is with Diligent, because we've already got lists of users built out within these group structures, within the main board, within the executive committee, and within the audit committee. And just with simple clicks, you can select who's going to receive this and have to respond to it. So it's a really nice way to easily, get this survey out to the respondents without having to use email or any other communications tool. As soon as you bring a assessment or evaluation type template into email, you've pretty much defeated the purpose of the anonymity. You're going to know who's responding to things, you're going to know who sent it, and it offers email communication just in general at the board level is very susceptible to mistakes, and both because of hacks that are happening in the marketplace and because of information just being inadvertently sent to the wrong people through automation tools in Outlook. So it's really important to be able to automate that process and get surveys in folks' hands without being too reliant on email. So then finally, you're going to be ready to complete that process and send it out to the directors, and they'll be ready to go ahead and respond to it. So I'm going to go ahead and transition now over to a different view. So bear with me one moment while I do that. There we go. So here we're going to take a look at my iPad screen. And the reason we're going to do this is we want to take a look at a director level view of the Diligent Board's application and how the questionnaires are managed inside the tool. So this is a typical director view of an iOS app for Diligent. And you'll see a number of icons here. I'm going to click the sandwich icon up top here. And you can see we have a pretty robust menu of options here, including questionnaires right here. And I'll also give a little commercial for our own secure messaging product, Diligent Messenger, which is easily accessed from this portal as well. That's a topic for another webinar, however. We're going to stay focused on the questionnaires and the evaluations here. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. So it's an easily one-click process there. And you can see that we have a very easy to follow interface here between active and inactive surveys or evaluations. So the inactive one is going to be one that was previously completed. I can always go back into that and go ahead and review that content if I'd like. And then I've got a new annual board evaluation here that I'm going to go ahead and resume to give you a sense of what this experience would look like as a director. I'm going to go ahead and log back in here because I was idle a little too long. We'll allow it a moment to load, and then we'll see very similar to what we saw on the preview page previously. We'll see our instructions here. We'll scroll ahead to some new pages, and you can see that this is organized exactly as it was on our table of contents earlier. So each page, you're going to be able to scroll up and down and answer these various questions. So, for example, if I go ahead and apply an answer to this question here, it's going to go ahead and quickly save that response. And you can quickly scroll through and do this. Really nice interface, really easy to follow. If I click next page, it's going to stop me from going ahead because I did make all of the responses in this survey as required. So I'm not going to go through and bore you with clicking a whole bunch of boxes to go forward, but just wanted to give you a quick sense of what that would look like. Let's go ahead and transition back to the presentation, and we'll finish up the different views here. So once you have completed the survey process, or actually when directors are in the process of completing the survey, you're actually going to be able to manage that through our submission manager. So that's actually not visible until you have actually completed and published a survey. So you'll see here I'm highlighted on the I published survey here. Submission manager becomes an option. And if we drill into that, we can see here that it is indeed an anonymous survey. We have a number of respondents, but we don't have anyone complete yet because this is a brand new survey we just offered. We would see these complete as a percentage of their questions completed, both in total across the entire board and on an individual basis. So it's a great tool to stay on top of directors. Even though we don't know who's not responding, we can follow up with various communications methods to encourage them to go ahead and complete the process. The next step in the process is going to be analytics, the post analysis of all the data that we gather in this survey process. So you can see up here, there's a link to drive the analytics. So when we click that, we end up with a variety of different menus. So we can create really nice, already formatted PDFs of actionable data that comes out of this process. And they can be formatted in standard ways, such as pie charts and bar charts. And we'll show you some examples of what those look like here shortly, even just table formats of the raw data. And then we could also certainly export the raw data. There may be additional analysis that you'd like to do, additional report types, additional chart types that you'd like to leverage in your presentation to the board, and you can create those by exporting the raw data into Excel and manipulating them as you desire. So to wrap up, just a couple examples here. Here's an example of our bar graphs, giving a sense of how folks agree or disagree with board meeting attendance. Here's an example of a pie chart that was from a survey conducted not too long ago. Really nice graphical interface there. And then table of the raw data. So I think that about covers it in terms of the overall demonstration. I think we can transition back to you, Dottie, if you have any other comments or questions. And we could also open it up to questions here shortly.
Yeah, that's
Dottie?
great. Thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead, Diane.
We have a few questions for you and Jeff
Great.
that have popped up, so I'm hoping you can answer them. The first one, should we use the same questionnaires every year to compare results and see how the board improved over the years?
Yeah, I would say the answer to that one is an easy yes. So I think, look, I had made the comment before that you might want to kind of go back and take a look at your survey instrument from year to year and, potentially make some adjustments. And I think that is certainly true. I think, for example, It may be that you've started a new initiative in the past year that you want to get some understanding of how successful that's been from the director's perspective. And so, it would be useful to maybe add a little bit of questions around that particular thing. So maybe the initiative would be a new approach to board education. Maybe quarterly you were doing some type of additional education at the meetings and you wanted to assess the success of that program. Certainly would be important to add questions about that on the evaluation. But generally speaking, things regarding performance, it's good to basically measure how well the board is performing against a set of criteria and then benchmark how that changes year over year. The criteria might change from year to year. Like one year, you may need a variety of different kinds of members on the board that focus on a particular part of the industry. Maybe 3 years later, that's no longer a focus. Maybe that was, a decision to kind of drop that line of business. And so you're really kind of looking for different criteria from the board at that stage. But the performance measure itself is the thing that you want to benchmark over time. So generally speaking, I think it's always a good idea to start with, what did we do last year? And then reflect on, do we need to add or change anything for this year? And Jeff, I bet if I were to ask you, you could tell us, is that something that they can do using the software? Are they able to kind of take something that they've done in the past and make it fresh, but then make changes to it for the upcoming year?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the key features of the software is the ability to duplicate, previously used assessment templates and use them year over year. It's so important to do that comparative analysis year over year. So that's a key part of the software is the ability to duplicate what you've done in the past.
That's great. That's great. And Diane, while we're answering questions, I know we did have one other very quick poll that we wanted to just ask people to give us a sense for what they are doing now. And so I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll while we're answering questions, but go ahead and feel free to ask the next question.
Great. Excuse me. The next question is, what would you know as the most important categories that should be covered in a board and evaluation? Excuse me.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think actually when we were taking a look at Jeff's screen and he was walking us through the process, there were a number of questions on there that I think are exactly the right categories. So first of all, I think it's really important for the board to have clarity of what its purpose really is and what its job actually entails. And as you get that clarity of purpose and job description, that should dictate what goes into the evaluation form. So for example, he had a number of different areas laid out in that evaluation form, including, some questions around, board ability to engage, board's ability to come in and, how many meetings do we have where we've got full attendance versus not full attendance? Had some questions in there around the individual performance of directors. I think if you align the questions with performance and with the criteria for what made for a successful board and what makes for a successful director, those are the right questions to ask. Jeff, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add there.
No, that's great, Dottie. I think that was a great answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the template that we were kind of showing on the screen here, I think we had about, maybe 30 questions or 25 questions, somewhere in that neighborhood. So it doesn't have to be a ridiculously long instrument in order to get some useful data. Really what you want to try to do is figure out the different areas of responsibility of the board and the different parts of a director's performance that matter. Things like, I think we had in there, comes prepared to meetings, arrives fully prepared for meetings, offers useful insight, has the skill sets necessary to be competent in that role. You could just ask those three things. I mean, if someone gets a really low rating on all three, clearly there's a conversation needed. Clearly there's some investigation that needs to happen. So it doesn't have to be super long, and you don't have to ask 50 questions to arrive at useful information. In fact, I think what often can happen is evaluation instruments get so long that it gets a little unwieldy, and that's part of the concern. So I'm going to close the poll. It looks like we now have our results. And so we had, looks like in terms of the way that people conduct evaluations, we have 29% that are using external consultants, which is a little higher than the national average. The national average is about 21%, so that's interesting. We've got 24% that are using online surveys, something like SurveyMonkey, for example. About 12% that are using, a PDF or Excel or Word. And then 24%, just about the same number that are doing online surveys, are using paper. And then we have 12% that marked other, and of course we don't know really what other is, but we would be interested to hear what other ways people are approaching, doing the evaluation process itself. So that's really interesting. But I think that the breakdown between paper and online, I think, again, one of the issues with going with paper is that there is absolutely zero way to make paper anonymous. And so that speaks to the fact that we've got, kind of high national averages on board evaluations as a whole, and that people are not really doing anything with the data. It's probably because they all sort of know this data is not that useful. It's not actually going to tell us the real issues that need to be dealt with, because we weren't able to be as candid and as forthcoming as we could be if we knew that not even the person administering the survey knows who said what. I mean, even in the case of using an external consultant, there's the potential, if they're not using an anonymous process, that they know who said what. And so, potentially there could be pressure put on them by, either the lead director, even the CEO or the audit committee to disclose who said something in particular. So there really is great value in having a completely blind process, because then you actually can get a bit more candor, and people can feel comfortable saying the things that are really on their minds. Well, I think we are basically right at time.
We are. We have a few other questions, and we will get back to you individually on that. So thank you. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. A replay of the webinar will be sent to you shortly. If you have any questions or would like a full demonstration of diligent boards, please let us know. And again, thank you again, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. It was great talking with you. Thanks for joining us. And Jeff, thanks. That was awesome.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dottie.
Thanks.